Hey YouTube, Irish Air Gunner coming at you. After I did my video on the review of the Sports HDIR by Hawk, a couple people have sent me some emails asking about how do you mount a scope. So today we're going to go over the basic steps that I use to mount my scopes. There are plenty of videos out there and people do different techniques, but I'm going to show you, like I always do, the shortcuts, the inexpensive things that you need at home, and how I get best accuracy out of my mounts. When looking for a scope, you want to look for some basic things. You have to determine what you're going to do with it. If you're going to be shooting 1/4-inch paper targets at 75 yards, you don't want a 3x9. You might want something a little powerful like a 6x24 or even an 8x32. If your main goal with this air gun is to shoot paper targets, silhouettes, or cans at 25 yards, a 3x9 or a 4x12 will actually do real good. This scope here is the Hawk Sports HDIR 4x12 by 50. I purchased this scope for my Benjamin Discovery because the Discovery I'm not going to take past 40 yards. 50 yards maybe at some larger targets. It's not a long range gun for me. After you made your scope selection and you have your scope, the next thing is to determine the size of the tube. The center points, the Hawk Sport HDs, and a lot of the smaller leapers are 1-inch tubes. When you get into the Hawk Eclipses, the Hawk Sidewinder Tacs, and some of the other scopes, they're 30mm tubes. So you have to determine which scope you have to get the right rings to fit your gun. Since we're mounting the Hawk Sports HDIR, it's a 1-inch tube. So as you can see, I have the 1-inch rings by AccuShot. The scope rings come in low profile, medium, or high profile. Why it's imperative to get the right scope height is because of the magazine. Obviously in the Benjamin Discovery it's single feed, so you don't have a magazine. But when you get into the Marauders and you get into other air rifles, you want to make sure that you have clearance between the scope and the magazine, so that way you can get your magazine in and out. If you're not sure, I recommend that everybody go with the high mount, because with the high mounts you'll definitely have the clearance. And being an air rifle, there's really no difference between medium and low in your ranging or your accuracy. It all comes down to your zeros. In front of you, you'll see the essential tools that you're going to need to mount a scope. Inside to the left, you'll see a Hawk bubble level, some extra screws for scope mounts, 2 line levels, some Allen wrenches, and some fill adapters. Also, you'll see a flat level that I bought at Walmart, and I'll show you what that's used for later. All these, with the exception of the Hawk mount, can be bought over the counter at any Walmart or Lowe's or Home Depot. The first thing I do before I mount a scope is I take a rag and I wipe the scope rails. As I wipe the scope rails, I get all fingerprints, oils, any dirt that may be on there, because when you mount the scope, whatever's on there is going to be between the rings and your rails. When you look at your scope rings, there is definitely a front and back. Does it really make a difference? No, but I'll show you here in the next video why it's important on some guns. As you can see on the scope ring on the left, there's a hex screw that comes down through the base. What this is for is if you mount the scope onto a Springer or a spring-powered rifle, due to the recoil, the scope rings will slide. So what that screw does is allows you to screw it down, securing it into the rail of the air gun. On Springers, there's a hole on the top of the rails that lets you screw this down into there, because when you shoot and the recoil from the spring kicks back, it won't move your scope. So if you use a Springer, that has to go to the back. The next thing you want to do is remove the hex screws from the top, separating the top of the ring from the base. Now let's go mount the bases. And remember to use the base with the hex screw for the rear. I hand loosen the base screws, then I slide it onto the rail and I hook it onto the dovetail. Once I have it hooked, I generally put it where I want to put it, and I hand tighten it so it doesn't slide. Now let's mount the front. Mounting the front is very similar. You just merely slide it onto the rail. Once you have it to generally where you think it should be, you hand tighten it. Now that we have our bases in position, you want to look and just make sure that they're not going to ride over anything, over magazine wells, and make sure they're not going to get caught on the bolt. And then you want to keep them on the both parallel to the same side. I have the screws set on the right hand side. I have the back to the rear and obviously the front to the front. Being lined up with the screws on the same side, then you're going to have the general alignment that come from the factory to keep it straight. Now that you have your rings or your base mounts in place, the next thing you want to do is place your scope. Obviously, when you mount your scope, you want to make sure that you have your top and your right side. So therefore, you don't want to mount it backwards or upside down. And you put it in place or where you generally think it's going to be. As you can see in the position that we placed the scope, looking good. It's actually, if we mounted it there, we would never be able to turn the objective because the objective is clearly sitting on top of the front sights. So how we correct that? So we slowly glide the scope forward till we clear the sights. And that is the farthest back that scope can go. As you can see, we barely clear the front mount, and that's only because the cap's on. Now that we have the scope in the position that we want it, the mounts are way set back. This is why you hand tighten everything until you're done. So all we do is we loosen up the base, put the base where it needs to be, hand tighten it back down, and there we go. You can now do the same thing with the front. You try to keep the base mount centered on the tube. So now that we put the tube there, we can hand tighten the base down. Now your bases are aligned and they can be tightened down with a wrench. All you do at this point is put the Allen hex wrench in, turn. I always go by quarter turns to 1/8 of an inch turns. Tighten the front. They're snug. Come back. 1/8 of a turn, 1/8 of a turn, they're tight. I come back, 1/8 of a turn, till you hear a little bit of a crunching noise, and they're tight. Same thing. Snug, and the crunching noise, tight, and they're set. Before you mount the rings, you want to double check again. Since we move things, you want to make sure your clearance. You have your clearance in the event that we had a magazine, we'd be able to get it out on either side. And you're not blocking any of the bolt or any of the operation. And you're good. The next thing you want to do is take your top of the rings, place them over. Use your Allen screw and just start the threads. Start the front and the back. These threads are very small. If you cross thread them or meet any resistance, stop and try it again. If you cross thread them, you won't be able to tighten them down. Once you have the rear done, you come up, repeat the process, and start on the front. At this point, what I like to do is I like to tighten them down to the point where there's a little bit of marginal play. And I'll show you. They're just hand tight, using the wrench of course, to the point where they'll still turn. The scope will still turn and still slide. So you can make adjustments, but it won't fall out and you won't lose your place. Once you do the front, then you do the rear. Now that we have our scope mounted, it looks really good. It looks like a professional job. But here comes the hard part.